Well, it wouldn't be a normal week in Formula One without Helmut Marko making headlines. And he has done that again because he has pointed the finger, claiming that the budget cap breach was leaked prior to Red Bull getting official word that it had fact broken any rules. I'm curious if you think Red Bull has a leg to stand on here, guys.
I can see where they're coming from, because before we knew any details about what happened, or before the deadline for when the FIA were going to announce who had met the budget cap and who hadn't, pretty much everyone in the paddock already knew that Red Bull had breached it in some way or another. And in Singapore, I was in that paddock, and it became very apparent very quickly that there had been a breach. Mercedes were talking about it. Toto Wolff was talking about it. He didn't name Red Bull. A number of people were quite careful in how they talked about this. But he did say it was an open secret that two teams had breached the cap as well, breached the financial regulations in some way. One of them had breached the cap in a big way. And Ferrari were talking about it as well. So there's all sorts of people talking about it. And, you know, Red Bull throughout this, I think quite early on must have realized that they had indeed breached the cap and that they were in for some kind of penalty. And I think a lot of their tactics has been to play the victim a bit and kind of put themselves forward as the guys that have been hard done by. The reputational damage of people speculating about how much they'd breached the cap before the real details came out, stuff like that. And so this is what they seem to be continuing to push with. And it's not unlike Helmut Marko to set his target on Mercedes and Toto Wolff in particular, and kind of claim that. So yeah, they're also claiming that Shayla Ann Rao, who was a former legal counsel at Mercedes, moved across to the FIA earlier this year, that she was then, this is a fact, involved in the budget cap analysis and looking at the teams, and also deciding what, to some extent, was included in the budget cap and what wasn't. And so Red Bull are pointing to that and saying, look, isn't this a bit odd that a former employee of Mercedes ended up at the FIA and then was in charge of deciding pretty critical things here in determining who was within the cap and who was outside it. So, you know, that did all happen. That is the case. And it will be interesting to see where it goes from now, whether it will just be a bit of kind of mudslinging and a few barbed quotes here and there, or whether the FIA will have to explain, you know, exactly her role within the whole process. But yeah, it's kind of standard F1, isn't it? We've got used to this politics, and it never goes away. Just when you think it's in the back of it, something else pops up.
Yeah, I think it is very Red Bull to be throwing things out. I mean, you know, I think one of the quotes that hasn't aged at all well, and people pointed out in Austin was pretty low. Was, I think, Horner, you know, played the mental health card, didn't he? And he said, you know, some of our kids are being bullied and stuff, and people were pretty annoyed at that when they heard that in the media center. So when you say that, and then you have Helmut Marko coming out, it's a bit like the boy that cried wolf, isn't it? Like, you can't keep saying, like, quite literally, boy that cried wolf in this case, if you spell wolf with two F's. Sorry, that's a terrible joke. It's that I thought that was,
he at least owned up to it.
I thought it was funny as I said it, and then I was like, actually, that's terrible. But never mind. It's out there now. It's recorded. It's out there. So I think it becomes difficult to sympathize with Red Bull, because, you know, if you keep hearing the victim card, when it's the reason we're talking about this is, again, as we've talked about on previous,
because you broke the rules.
Yeah, it's like, you know, I try my best to put myself in a position where I'm like, all right, let's, you know, there is two sides to every story, but it just gets quite old quite quickly when you hear that stuff. And Laurence is right, you know, it's right in the kind of Helmut Marko. I mean, I think pretty sure every weekend I've worked in Formula One, there's been some Marko quote from somewhere, whether it's in German press or Dutch press, and you kind of almost become desensitized to it. You're like, yeah, okay, cool, he said something, and you know, you almost ignore them. So yeah, it's a shame that it's turned into mudslinging, but it's part of me does think, I think to give Red Bull some to kind of, you know, give them some credit here in terms of what they're saying. I think the whole process was really damaged by the fact that everyone knew for so long, because I think that for 2-3 weeks it basically became known that someone had done it, and then it became very known very quickly Red Bull had done it, and it was kind of because the FIA really, you know, didn't communicate or wasn't in a position to communicate things. A lot of people wanted to see XYZ punishment when really, you know, your championships going, etc., was never on the cards. And I think they felt that it went on needlessly long. So I'd give them that much. But I think anything beyond that is yeah, it's just a bit cheap given the reason we're all talking about it.
Sure.
But also, this is nothing new. The paddock operates.
Oh
on
yeah,
rumors.
yeah,
That's how we do our
true.
job. Is that
Yeah.
you'll hear lots of little things being put out from an early stage, and the first time you hear it, you think, well, okay, that's possible, but you have to go and verify it with someone else, because there's lots of rumors that start which are completely untrue, and I think people are just trying to put little stories out there and see how far they go. But then sometimes it is the case, and and then this one was the case. Okay, arguably some of the stuff Toto said about a team breaking it by a big margin was incorrect, but it was true that two teams had broken the financial regulations. One of them had breached the cost cap, and so it's one of those things. It's like, well, they, while it maybe that info shouldn't have leaked out in exactly the way it did, it's such a small paddock. So many people go from one place to another place. That's not unusual, including the FIA to teams and vice versa. Usually there's a bit of a more extended gardening leave. I think that's another thing that Red Bull were a bit surprised at how quickly the lawyer went from Mercedes to the FIA. But still, it's that is part of how the paddock works. It's kind of part of what makes it interesting, certainly from our perspective as journalists.
Again, great Netflix episodes coming out of this, and just quickly to round this point off, I spoke to two press officers two team principals in Austin off record, one whose team is supplied by Mercedes, one who's isn't, and they both said they had no issue with the lawyer, and or at least no issues in terms of what Helmut Marko has suggested. Now that's just two people, but it's interesting that two other people were like, no, it's not an issue. Sure. So yeah, it seems like if every other team in the paddock was saying, well, we didn't breach, but actually, yeah, they've got a point there, you'd think maybe there is some smoke there. But yeah, it doesn't seem to be the case.
Thanks for watching ESPN on YouTube. And for more sports highlights and analysis, be sure to download the ESPN app. And for premium content plus live streaming, make sure to subscribe to ESPN Player.